Hi, hello, welcome back to our review kit on tax. So let's look at this question, past question on partnership tax. Okay, Farike, Femi, Kola, and Benga have been in partnership as medical practitioners for 8 years. The statement of profit or loss for the ended 2021 is as follows. So they give us their statement of P&L, give us income expenses. Okay, then sorry. Okay, no additional information. Then we have sorry, let me check additional information. Yeah. So then, included the salary and wages is one to paid for each of the what partner. So that's the partner salary. So okay, all right. Then rent and rate comprises rent paid to partner. So they pay to this partner Fadike 1.44 million. Then rate is 60,000. Rate is what? Rate is 60,000. All right. So let's go. The miscellaneous expenses, the donation to a church in the hometown of Fadike 50,000. Allowance paid to domestic staff of Femi 240. Cost of repair and maintenance on the residence of each partner 840. Okay, and then office repairs is how much? 320,000. 320,000. Okay, all right. So let's go. All right. Then okay. Then capital allowance agreed with the revenue service was 980,000. Profit are to be shared equally among the partners. Fadike and Femi are married with 3 children and 2 children. Fadike has a life assurance policy of 960 on which she pays 96,000 annually as what? As premium. Annually as what? As premium. Okay. All right. Then what else? Fadike maintains her age father who is over 6 years. For the relevant year of assessment, first is we have to compute the income of partnership, then compute the income tax liability of each of the what? Partners. Okay. All right. So let's go and solve. Okay. Partnership. Okay. So the first thing is we have to compute what? We have to compute in a minute. Okay. Compute what? Let me check what's the name. Compute income of partnership. So income of the partnership. Okay. So let's go. Income of partnership. Alright, so let's go. Alright, so let's go. Let's go and compute the income of the what? The different partnerships. Okay. So we have so the first thing, of course, is start from the net profit given in the question. Then we add back allowable and what disallowable what expenses. So let's go. So what's the net profit? Okay. Alright, this is 87,091,900. So let's go it 87 what? So net profit. Net profit 87 what? 87,091,900. 87,091,900. Okay. Alright. Then we add back some disallowable expenses. Okay. Of course, let's check the question. So let's look at the expenses and we'll start picking ones that are not allowable there. Okay. Alright. So let's go. So our salary which is allowed, rent and rate. Let's go and see. Let's go and see what makes up rent and rate. Okay. So okay, give me a minute, please. Alright, so our rent and rate. Okay, so what did it tell us about rent and rate? Okay, rent and rate. Rent includes rent paid to partner, which is Fadike and what? And rate 60,000. Alright, so as at this point, the rent and rate will be allowed because it was paid, like even though it was paid to a partner, we'll use this in computing partner's income tax, but because it's still a business expense, it's still an allowable expense. So transport and traveling, telephone is allowed. Okay, not running expense allowed. Allowance for doubtful debt, provision for bad fare is not an allowable expense. So add back allowance for doubtful debt. For doubtful debt. For doubtful debt. Allowance for doubtful debt is how much? Let's have 2 Naira columns. So we can do it that way. So where's second Naira column? Allowance for doubtful debt is how much? 310,000. Okay, 310,000. 310,000. Okay. Next we have what? Let's go back again. What else do we have in the question? Okay. Miscellaneous expenses. We check if rational. Other professional charges allowed. Audit fees allowed. Bank charges. Depreciation is not what? Allowed. Depreciation. So depreciation is not allowed. So let's add back our depreciation. Depreciation. How much is our depreciation? Depreciation is how much? Where are you? 1,240,600. 1,240,600. Okay. Next, what else do we have? Interest on loan, we'll treat that when we get to partners. Interest on capital will be treated. Passage and leave allowance will be treated under income of partnership. All right, great. So let's look at other ones that we have. Okay. Okay, salaries and wages is also allowed. Okay. All right, then rent. Now, miscellaneous expenses, donation to church is not as part of what? It's not part of the allowable expenses. So donation to local church will be added back. Local church is how much? Let's check how much is addition to local church. That's how much? That's 50,000. So 50,000. That's added back. The church local church is 50,000. Okay. Then next, allowance paid to domestic staff of what? Femi. That's a private expense, so it's going to be added back. Let's add allowance paid to domestic staff. Femi. How much is that? Let's check. That's how much? That's 240,000. So we'll add that back to 240,000. All right. Next, what else do we have? We have then. What else do we have in the question? Cost of repair and maintenance of the residence of each partner. This is not allowed. Their own personal residence. So we add it back. So repair and maintenance of residence. Repair and maintenance of partner's residence. Residence is not an allowable expense, a private expense. That's how much? That's 840,000. So we add it back 840,000. So let's add up. How much do we have? Okay, so all right, let's add. Okay, all right. So that's how much. That's let's add up. So this will give us how much? This is 2,680,600. 2,680,600. All right. So 2,680,600. Okay. So let's go. So we have sorry. Then this should come here. All right. So we add it back. Let's add this back to this. So how much is our adjusted profit? Adjusted profit 89,772,500. 89,772,500. Then we do our capital allowance, less capital allowance. They told us, they giving us that in the question, that they have agreed the tax authority that capital allowance is how much? Okay, is 980,000. So we remove 980,000. Okay, so that will give us profit that the partners will share. So this will be minus 980,000. So let's do that. So how much is the profit that partners will share now? They will share 88,792,500, and said they will share it equally. So 88,792,500. That's the first part. I've gotten the first 5 marks. Let's now go and do the more one that will score marks. Calculation of personal income tax for partners. Calculation of PIT for partners. So the first thing is, of course, their share of profit will come in. So how many partners do we have? Fadekemi, Femi, and what? And Kola. Okay, I think those are the 3 partners we have. Let me check. Okay, sorry. All right, Fadekemi. Therefore, Fadeke, Femi, Kola, and Benga. So let's have column for it. Fadeke. After Fadeke, who is next? We have what? Femi, Kola, and who else again? We have what? We have Benga. All right, so let's go. So let's look at how do we do this for them now. So what we're going to do is this. First is their share of profit. So we'll calculate all the total income they have, remove allowable expenses. Now let me come here. I will not fully solve the question because it depends on what you are given in the exam. You know, in the exam, according to the new tax laws, we have a new tax table and rent relief. And it's possible they also give you the old tax table that we have. I've taught you how to do personal income tax table. So please, that will determine which one you will use in the exam. So they will give you which one you will apply in the exam, but at least we are familiar with how to use the tax table. Then let's have a column for total. So I'll just show you how to calculate their total income, then the allowable expenses, and then the reliefs and the tax table. That one is quite straightforward. Okay, so let's divide 88,792,500 by 4. So okay, so equals to this divided by 4. Okay, that gives us 22,198,125. So that's what everybody will get. 22,198,125. Okay. Alright, so let's add, so that it will still give us our total of how much? 88,792,500. 88,792,500. Okay, so let's go. That's their share of profit, right? Let's now start. So let's look at other income. They got interest on loan. So how much is interest on loan? Let's check the question for each of them. How much interest did the business pay them for loans? Okay, I think it's additional information, sorry. Alright. No, it's in that trial balance. Let's look at it. Alright, interest on loan, you can see Fadeke, Femi, Kola, and Benga. So let's put it there. 300,000. Okay. Next is how much? Next is 240,000. Next is how much? Next is 180,000. 150,000. Okay. 150,000. So let's add up. How much is that going to give us in total? That gives us what? 870,000 in total. Alright. Then interest on capital too. Interest on capital that they got. Okay, that's another income for them, so they will have to pay tax on it. The interest on capital is how much? Let me look at it. So 1,250 for everybody. So let's go. So let's just put that 1,250,000 for everybody. Okay. So then total will give us how much? That will give us 5 million in total. 5 million in total. Okay. Next, you have what? Their salaries. They collected salaries. Okay. So we're going to include that as part of their personal income tax. So salaries. So how much salary did they collect? Okay, we still come to passage and leave allowance. Salaries. Okay, included in salaries is 1 to pay to each partner. So everybody got 1.2. So 1.2, 1,200,000. Okay, for everybody. So let's go. So alright, so that'll give us 4.8 in total. So that's salaries. Okay. Next you have what? You have then they told us, I'm coming. They told us they give them one allowance. Okay. Passage and leave allowance. So that's also part of their income. Passage and leave allowance. Passage and leave allowance. So let's go. How much is that passage and leave allowance? So let's go. So that's 660,000. Another 660,000. Next, how much is for the next person? We have how much? 660. Okay. Sorry. Then okay, everybody is 660. Alright, 660. Alright, so let's add. So that'll give me around 2,640,000. Alright, so then next we have what? We have then I think they said they pay rent to one partner, and that's going to be income. Okay, yeah, rent paid to partner, Fadeke, so he's going to pay income tax on it. So rent is only Fadeke, 1 million, how much? 1,440,000. Okay, so and this will give us their total what? Total income before we do any relief. So let's add up. How much is it going to be? So this gives us what? 2704. Okay, I'm coming. I've added salary. This will give me what? I'm coming 22,198, 300, 1,250. Passage and leave allowance 660, 1.2. Alright, this will give me how much? This will give me 27,048,125. So 27,048,125. Okay. So then for this guy, how much is Femi? Femi is how much? 25,548,125. Okay. 25,548,125. Okay. For Kola is how much? 25,488,125. Okay. Then Benga, how much is Benga's one? Benga's one is 25,458,125. The same thing with what? The same thing with, and this. Then let's add up. How much is this in total? It's giving me 103,572,500. So 103,572,500. Great. So please, this is it. Then why I said I'll finish up is that you can now use the tax table and the reliefs. Do you get? But that depends on whether they are bringing the new tax laws or it. I'm still going to send. I'm going to do a video explaining the new tax laws and the things you need to pay attention to in case it comes out in the exam. All right. Thank you.